I said I'm a little embarrassed because I've been giving a version of this talk for for almost a decade now. It was first a version of it. And I thought, when I saw unification, I've done a lot of work on modernity, so I didn't want to go there. But when I saw unification, I thought this would be a good idea, and sort of build in the idea of what modernity and how it links to the past, and how futures link to the past or do not. And so I am trying to do this, use some of those materials and some new ones to talk about different ways in which the future could go, because there are different trends in history, right? There are different phases in history. So that is my goal. So I think most of you know this history of Asia as a region, which basically formed, and we've been hearing this all day, and we'll be hearing it all week and all year, these two kinds of routes, the landed Silk Route from China to the Mediterranean, including several southern routes to South Asia. Then from around 1300, you get the networks of Asian maritime trade, which are more natural because in part they also depend on, natural than maritime trade today, for instance, because they depend very much on monsoon winds and so on. Take them, and they depend very much on the coastal regions and so on. And a very important part of that is, of course, Malacca, which as the entrepot, which I'll just show you a little bit of that for those who are not familiar. And this had very large numbers, networks of Chinese, Indian, Jewish, Arab merchants with sophisticated credit transfer mechanisms and trading techniques that enabled wholesale and this what they call forward carrying trade, all the way from Zanzibar to actually parts of even Japan, I would say, that took place at this time. Now, with the colonial domination of this trade, especially even before steamships, with this what the Europeans did discover technologically was deep sea navigation, right? They didn't have to hug the coasts. And this also gave them enormous power. This gave them the capacity to carry huge militaries along with it and so on. And but even so, they had to depend on these networks of merchants and so on for local penetrations, for all kinds of things. Vasco da Gama himself was dependent on a whole set of African, Muslim, and Indian traders and Hindu traders to get to Kerala. Now, but on their own, most of these networks did decline. But on their own, the Chinese, the Jewish, and Indian merchant networks survived this colonial domination, although they were not exactly the same groups, but related groups who, through all kinds of different mechanisms, what we might call comprador mechanisms, were able to develop this. And what we see is that by the 20th century, what Hamashita Takeshi, the very famous Indian Ocean and South China Sea historian, calls Kosa network, cross networks of Chinese and Indian financial groups in Singapore and Hong Kong, which sort of really merge with these older financial groups, merge with these new banks and so on. And there's a lot of funding that becomes available from there, and this becomes a very important form of capital supply. So the point here I'm trying to make is that the Asian maritime trade and the relatively peaceful means of creating connections, interdependencies among different polities was the common path of Asia. So that's your your title of the common path of Asia. It's literally a path which can be understood in terms of a route, but it can also be understood in terms of the norms and rules. And Abu Lughod has some very good descriptions of that. So this kind of region formation, I think, represents one kind of history, right? Which could be a history of the future. Obviously, mutatis mutandi, but the principles could work. Okay. Oh, this is very counterintuitive. The top one goes down. Okay, so here it is. I was telling you about the natural patterns. So this is the land and maritime, but the maritime route you see has this. This is Malacca here, for those of you who don't know. And of course, what would happen is that the winds would bring, the monsoon winds would bring the Chinese traders to this area. They would wait here for Arab and Indian traders to come, exchange their goods, and go back when the winds changed. That became a very important entrepreneur trade. And they had actually lots of dealings. We have one of the great specialists on this here, so I shouldn't be talking about this, Mr. Tan Sen Sen. But, okay, I'll just give you the background, and he'll give you the details. But I do want to talk a little bit about how we conceptualize regions, because if you're talking about unification and so on, I think you have to have a sense of how you conceptualize regions. One has to have. What I call, and this is my definitions, what I call region formation is something that is relatively natural, economic, religious, intellectual networks and interactions, right? It is not, whereas regionalism and regionalization is the efforts to create a region by a political state, or a group of intellectuals who sort of, create the idea of the European Union, fund the politics and produce it, right? Or the Japanese, for instance, created their military got together and said, let's create the co-prosperity sphere. And so far as I know, barring the European Union, most of those region formations have not, of those regionalizations, have not done too well, unless they have a strong sort of from the bottom up flow, if you know what I mean, autonomous flow. So, and by the late imperial period, in the 19th and 20th century, the region comes to be defined, of course, in the hegemonic mode of spatial production, to use the ideas of Lefebvre. Asia gradually becomes capitalist space. That what does it mean to be a capitalist space? Relations are abstract, standardized, exchangeable, and secured by property rights, right? This involves a whole massive transformation, which is what colonialism did. Then something else happens. The space becomes territorially bounded and controlled by states, especially nation states, but also colonial states, right? Which seeks to create, and this is very important, seeks to create a congruence between territory and culture. In other words, the state controls or dictates culture. So if you think of pre-modern times, your loyalties were to many different things. But the modern nation state demands loyalty to the nation state, and it claims that the nation state is the culture, right? So there isn't a sort of a crisscrossing or an imbrication or anything that is fully acceptable. This becomes a very important dimension of modernity. And we'll have to see how much this new form of Asia region making involves that or not. The nation space and capitalist space are continuous and collaborative, but also produce tensions between territorialization and deterritorialization. Modern regions emerge through continued network in these interstitial spaces. Goodness. We started very late, right? Yeah. I'm just on my third slide. Okay, one very important way to try and understand this older regional formation is that they're based on networks, right? As I mentioned earlier. By networks, I'm still, at least in this historical period, referring to social networks. But today, of course, the most important thing is these media networks, right? Media networks, whether through your cell phone or through all kinds of other, I don't even know these technologies. Anyway, social networks and even more contemporary media networks may be contrasted with social formations within a contained, bounded, territorially bounded, national, regionalized, organizational, or administrative entity. Of course, in reality, the two systems are interactive, but for analytical purposes, we need to keep these two separate. What networks do is spread between spaces of flow and are organized around changing hubs and nodes, which are often cities and so on, but they don't have to be. They have to be concentrations of a production of a certain type of book, maybe, which are points of control and attraction. They're typically not defined by or bounded, defined by bounded or contained spaces. Networks expand spaces of exchange and innovation. Trade, artifacts, ideas, innovations, beliefs, rituals, criminals, drugs, let's not forget the bad stuff, and ideals, advocacy groups, all develop within these. Asian maritime trade was such a network. Networks are carriers and shapers of history as much as national internalist models of history. I also have, maybe we can skip this. We don't have that much time. I have by the way, this is, I should put in a plug. My book of 2 years ago called The Crisis of Global Modernity, Asian Traditions and a Sustainable Future, is being published as we speak today by Shangwu Shudian in Chinese. And it was supposed to have arrived today, but maybe it'll come tomorrow. And the book has one of the most important concepts in the book is that of a circulatory history. And I think it is important in this. Because if you think of how events take place, they disperse over space and time. A major war can have different effects on prices of goods or political alliances sustaining a power structure in a third place. I often give this personal story of my ancestry. No, this time I go up. Oops. This place, I'm from this place called Assam in the Brahmaputra Valley here. And in the 14th century, till the 14th century, there was the Dailue Kingdom, which is an independent kingdom in the present region of Yunnan, which was a Buddhist independent kingdom. And they were, however, brought into the Chinese Empire with the Mongol invasion. The Mongols went through this, went all the way to Burma and down, right? But when the Mongols did that, the Dai went mostly to Thailand and became the Thai. There was another group called the Ahom who went westwards into Assam. And they then brought in, ultimately they Sanskritized and they brought in different communities of Hindus and so on. Although the place always had huge segments of different types of people. And in Assamese elites like to claim their descent from that kind of movement. So you see here how a distant, remote historical event that you could not imagine had effects on, it's very much like the butterfly's flutter. So narratives also disperse in time and are carried by networks which both shape and reshape their effects. So histories are also created through these networks and narratives, through these circulatory movements of people who do circulate, right? And narratives themselves have this. They tend to loop back to events and their concatenations with different meanings and endings contestation, differentiation, redirection narratives are based by different people in different places. For instance, something is celebrated as a great imperialist triumph in the early 20th century. By the late 20th century, that is seen as the most shameful event in world history, right? So, I mean, and the people of the country who also celebrated have to also learn that dimension of it. So there are all kinds of changes. Nothing remains in place here. So networks are better to understand the circulatory models of history. And then, which is not to deny that there you can also constitute institutional linear histories, but they're always being interpenetrated by these circulatory forces. And our real goal is to see how they interact. Okay. Oh, here's a very interesting examples of how within China you get the influence of different cultural traditions without being acknowledged, right? So this is the Taoist Avalokiteshvara, Chukho, Tianzun, right? The Taoist Avalokiteshvara Guanyin. Well, there was no such thing as a Taoist Guanyin, but they created one because they needed a salvation god. You know, Taoism didn't have a salvation god. And here these beautiful Izmi and this is a Mughal jade, all of which are of course based on Chinese ware and jade etchings and jade carvings, but all in Islamic and Arabic script, as you can see. Now the early modern is a very important era for circulations, 1500 to 1800s. There are many people who have talked about sort of circulatory history. Some people talk about connected histories, some people talk about entangled histories and so on. But I have a very distinct concept of circulatory history. And Goody and Jerry Bentley, Sanjay Subramaniam, all these people show that early modern Europe had both depended upon and contributed to the early modern world. There is no linear history there. And some examples, we have many examples. I'll give you the case of the Portolan, which is very important shipping mechanism that the Portuguese had, which was facilitated by cross-cultural brokers who assimilated Mediterranean navigation techniques for East Asian governance. So Changha's discoveries were both borrowed and also they were in turn borrowed, right, and developed further. So there were common cultures of travel, frameworks of religious debates with Jesuits and others in China and India, Sufism, Din Ilahi, Sanjao, and common millennial thought. All this was circulating all around these centuries. The European advantages were not overwhelming until the 18th century, either in military technology or in the economic strength. And there are many examples of that. In both value and bulk trade, Asian merchants carried the majority of the world trade till 1750. Control of the Atlantic trade gave Europeans resource advantage. It replaced the network with a militarized model, right? So now we come to a different model which is based on a territorial, capitalistic, and militarized model. Of course, the problem with that, it is an extremely attractive model, and everybody, of course, wanted to emulate it. So, and here's another, this is from the pages of the Mirat el-Qud of Akbar, Mughal Akbar, of the crucifixion of Christ, and I don't know what this other text is. So then you get, with this kind of militarization, you get also the creation of a new type of region where 20th century interwar imperial blocs represent a new stage for imperial advantage. Common currency standards, laws, especially in the interwar period. Regionalization comes to be modeled significantly on the nation, right? It is, remember the principle that I had talked about of Lefebvre, that it's the capitalist and national principle. And even colonial societies basically operated on that principle. Now, you know, the British, as early comers to this, they didn't bother too much with this. But the latecomer imperialists, like the Russians, the Germans especially, the Japanese, and the Americans, they understood very well that we have to create a common regional bloc in order and unify it and bring it under our command, right? But there was something else that they recognized, that this was already this is in the interwar period, or just before and then the interwar period. They already realized that nationalism was emerging as a major force, right? So they just couldn't impose this willy-nilly on their people. So a new strategy of imperialism developed, which I call the imperialism of nation-states. The best example of this is, of course, the Japanese idea of Manchukuo. Well, you can think of the Central European region of the Germanic things, also partly that. But the Japanese had a very strong rhetoric of we are all against these Western imperialists, and we are here as a common people with common territory, common yen and everything, and you guys will treat you directly as nation states and so on. But of course, there are two differences in this imperialism of nation states. There's all the rhetoric and institutions of the nation state, but two important things. Military control remains with the imperialist power, and financial control remains with the imperialist power, right? By the way, if you look at this is also what the US was doing in the Caribbean basin. If you look at this, ultimately, this is what the Russians were doing, even the Soviet Union was doing. And I see Lim Jae-hun may have some observations on this. So this is the kind of imperialism of nation states that I call it, right? So this new imperialism reaches, I think, its apogee in the Cold War with two superpowers dominating. Some form of regionalization is also created under SEATO and ASEAN. This kind of regionalization on the national model, where one state is hegemonic, is the history of the other kind of future that I said, right? So which way are we going to go? Now, I don't know that I have time. This is, all the Asian anti-imperialist thinkers and so on, like Okakura Tenshin, Rabindranath Tagore, Chang Tai-yen, Daiji Tao, Sun Chung-shan, all the Japanese Pan-Asianists and so on, who believed that Asia could come together as a region based on their high civilizational values and so on. That didn't go anywhere. It didn't go anywhere for two reasons. One, these were high culture intellectual projects. Second, they had no awareness of what the real processes of interaction of these Asian flows was about. Who were the coolies who were going where and that kind of thing. They didn't have the sort of, so it was an intellectual ideal. And most of them, in the end, opted for the nationalism. They gave up, whether it was Okakura or Chang Tai-yen even, who kept sort of saying, no, we believe in Asianism. But ultimately, he gave up. Tagore was probably the most cosmopolitan of the lot, but his ideas were overwhelmed by nationalism within India, right? So he was marginalized. Here are some pictures of that poetic moment of the adoration of Tagore, who was also hated in China, but by Shudermo and several other friends of his. And here's an example of Japanese Pan-Asian art. There's tons of this. There's a beautiful book on Pan-Asian art of the early 20th century by my friend, whose name I forget. Globalization, now in contemporary Asia, globalization is closely related. Wufan Chongma? Huh? Wufan. Scared him. Globalization is closely related to regionalization. Regions have emerged strongly after Cold War. In Europe, NAFTA, Mercosur, now Asia, ASEAN. Regions allow for economies of scale and competitiveness. But regions are also, for me, regions are important because they represent an intermediate stage between global and national problems. Regions are important because globalization produces wealth, but stratification and overconsumption of resources. Regions permit smaller clustering of sovereign or semi-sovereign agencies to tackle spill-out problems. Now, you all know about ASEAN, so I'm not going to talk about it. It became the most important thing about ASEAN, the 16 Asian the 10 plus 6 Southeast Asian societies that participate was that, it had created a kind of a very attractive, because it was a trading magnet, right? Places like Singapore and so on, and Hong Kong is also included, although it's not in ASEAN. And so, everybody, once they came together, everybody was climbing over, bending backwards to sign FTAs and agreements and so on with ASEAN. So when they did this, they became and the first country to sign the TAC, the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, was China. And China was most cooperative with this. So it would, so when I wrote this essay in 2010, China was very much on board with this whole ASEAN-based integration. And then 2011, 2012 happened, and things changed. But I do think that this is very important. If for no other reason, think of this. Interregional cooperation, the Himalayas, the circum-Himalayan region produces rivers that feed over 1 billion people, that nourish over 1 billion people across the region. And the glaciers are melting, the forests are eroding, but most of all, dams are being built, rivers are being diversified. Tens and tens of millions of these people have had to leave their homes, especially along the Mekong, along the Irrawaddy, along the Nu, and along the Brahmaputra as well, and in many other places. So, forget the Yellow River, it's pretty much dried up in many parts of China. So, what you need is a collective effort to address these issues. Because these are the commons, and they've become nationalized, right? So basically what I want to say is that, conclusion. So what I want to say is that China did participate in the Mekong River Commission and things like that in the early stages and so on. But since its dam building project, it went haywire, especially because it got the support of Laos and Cambodia, right? And it became a huge, Chinese hydropower projects, companies are among if you think American multinationals are big, think Chinese hydropower companies. So they have been but the good news, there's also good news. And I want to end with that little good news, is that although China has decided to go its own way by militarization and by pushing through, and rather than with the first path of Asian integration, it is not at all clear that it will go, and it is not at all. One of the most interesting things is that there's huge civil society organization in these Southeast Asian societies. Unlike in Central Asia, by the way, that's going to be a very important difference. And there's so much pressure on these companies and so on that they're ultimately responding, as in parts of Africa too. In Kenya and so on, they're responding. These corporations are responding. But when there's no pressure, It's like if you don't ask for your plastic bag, you don't get it. Right? So I would say that. Okay, sorry, I had to rush through this. Okay, whatever.